Living an abusive relationship is never easy. It's a really, really difficult thing, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. On average, it takes a woman 7 times of leaving and going back before finally leaving an abusive relationship. I know men are abused as well, but that statistic does refer specifically to women, so I've said women in that case. But the beginning of the end of my relationship actually happened quite some time before I left. I had to come to the realization that I couldn't change him, that I could only change me. I had to stop seeing him as this person that had 2 sides, somebody with a good side that was the real him, and a bad side that he wasn't responsible for, because it was this damaged part of him that I could save and rescue. And only when I came to that acceptance and realized that I had to accept him for who he was, right now I couldn't change him, and if I loved him unconditionally, then I had to just accept him the way he was. I realized that the relationship wasn't good enough for me. We didn't share the same values and goals, and I would probably look back at the relationship one day with regret that I had stayed and not left, and I realized I deserved better, I guess. We all go through a number of different stages because it is a complex process, leaving an abusive relationship. So we all go through these stages, and the first of the stages happen while you're still in the relationship. The first is that you are in denial. And everyone else around probably can see what's happening and that you're in this abusive relationship, but you can't. And part of the reason for this is that it's like we have Stockholm Syndrome. And Stockholm Syndrome was named after a bank robber who robbed a bank in Stockholm. And eventually, the captors that he'd taken hostage started to feel really sorry for him and started to side with him in the end. And what happens is when you're in an abusive relationship, a sort of traumatic bonding takes place. It's a very unhealthy attachment that we start to have towards our abuser. And it starts because they gradually isolate us from family and friends. And they hook us into this cycle of abuse where they've bombed us with all this love at the start and made us feel so fantastic and special. And then they gradually show us these glimmers of their dark side. So fleetingly that we ignore the warning signs and we long for that good person to come back. And when it does, we feel great again. And as the cycle goes round and round and round and round, we start to depend on them to feel good about ourselves. When they show us that remorse and that love, we get that high back and we start to depend on it. And so what happens is that the only one who can make us feel good about ourselves again, as this addiction to them starts to come into us, we depend on the very person we are needing to make us feel good about ourselves is the same person who's abusing us. So we have this traumatic bonding with them. And that is a very insidious thing, and it's a very difficult thing to break. The next stage is when we finally start to admit the reality of what's happening to us. We start to see it as a cycle of control, not love. We start to realize it's sort of an unhealthy addiction and it's not a healthy relationship. But we, in this phase, are very, very torn because we still have these strong feelings of love towards them and bonding, but we are starting to admit that reality. The next phase is when we start to prepare to leave, and that's when finally, having gone through that yo-yo phase of admitting reality, where one minute we admit it, and then we go back into denial again, and then we admit it, and then we go into denial again. We finally start to have our heads start to overrule our hearts at last, and tell us that if we stay in this relationship, actually we are now putting our lives and our safety in our lives at risk, and we are possibly in danger of the abuse getting worse and us really being hurt. So we no longer deny it. We no longer override our hearts with our heads. We start to see it for what it is and see them for who they are, and we start thinking, I have to leave. But again, it's really difficult to do that because we still love them. We didn't want to leave them. They've got us to a point where we feel we have no choice, but we still love them and we fear a future without them. What is it going to be like never seeing them again? Never seeing the person I love and I crave and need to make me feel good about myself. We have that terrible fear of the future, and we want them to admit to us that they were to blame and that we weren't unlovable and that they really do love us after all. But then what happens is the abuse gets worse and the lowers get lower, and one day some horrific event will finally happen, and that will be the straw that broke the camel's back, and that will be the thing that gives us the impetus to finally leave. And this is the most risky time in any abusive relationship, is when you leave. I think it's something like 75% of murders and injuries happen as a person is leaving or has left that relationship. So if you are at that stage, please, you must do this safely and come up with a safe exit action plan before you leave. And that is finding the right support and getting the right professional help, knowing the risk assessing your level of danger and knowing how to minimize that. So then once you've left and you've done so safely, it actually gets to the next phase, which is the maintenance stage, which is where you need to find the strength you've never thought you had. Now, leaving alone, you never realize how strong you are until you leave an abusive relationship. My God, you need courage and strength to do that. But what you don't realize is you think that's the end, and you think, okay, now I'm free. But actually, it can be the hardest and most difficult part. And this maintenance stage is where you have to find real strength. You need to stay strong because they will hoover you with everything they've got. That you will, get the level of remorse you've never seen before. You'll get promises to change like you've never seen before, that you're the only one for them. They might try to kill themselves. They might try to latch on the guilt and the blame and the shame that you're abandoning them. And it is a really, really hard phase. But if you can get through that difficult phase, and ways to do that is to go cold turkey and to cut off all contact, to get support with support groups or whoever you need to help you feel those painful emotions and process them rather than staying numb. If you can get through that painful part, then the next phase is the termination phase. And that's where you finally get to the point where you are no longer affected by that relationship. Your happiness is no longer dependent on them or anyone else for that matter. And you've found a sense of healthy self-esteem, and you get to a point where you can turn your life around and you can change it. So it is a long and slow process, leaving an abusive relationship. But you can get to that final stage, I promise you, because I have done it and I have turned my life around. I'm no longer defined by that violent relationship. And I've gone on to find a very happy life with healthy, long-term, wonderful love with a new partner. So you can do it. You can do it as well, I promise you. So that's it. That they are the stages of leaving an abusive relationship. It is difficult, but you can do it. And there is life after abuse, I promise you.